In preparation for this talk, I actually spent a lot of time reflecting on Joe Mann's wonderful talk last week. As you'll see, we actually have a lot of complementary research interests, and something that was sort of driven home for me last night is I think some of the types of memories that are really salient to me are when you're doing a final look over of your slides and your cat hops up onto your keyboard, proceeds to delete most of those slides, and then knocks the laptop off onto the floor. But it's okay, the laptop still works. I undeleted the slides, things are all good. She's sweet, she means well. But I hope that I can take that experience and maybe think about how to avoid that problem in the future. So maybe I will not work on the counter by her food bowl. That might be a smart choice. And actually, we humans are pretty good at juggling the sensory information and our goals and knowledge, such as what your cat does when you prop up next to her food bowl, in order to traverse our world and flexibly interact with our environment. And our memories, they really play a key part in this. Because memories, they don't only just define who we are as individuals. So for example, I am an academic and I'm excited and proud to be an academic here at Georgia Tech. But we also use our memories in order to guide decision making and to plan for the future. And so, when our memories fail, well, we might retread past mistakes like, well, truthfully, I probably will have this problem again with my cat. We might also find ourselves hopelessly lost when we're trying to find our way over from Emory to campus, if you decided to come and see this talk locally. And we might find ourselves failing to plan an important event. And all of these are actually really big problems. They can get us in a lot of hot water. And so because of that, a major focus of our lab is to try and understand the complex mechanisms that support long-term memory and enable us to avoid those types of errors. And one way that we go about studying this in our lab is by studying spatial navigation. Because that is a really naturalistic scenario where in our daily lives we're constantly drawing on our memories in order to make decisions about where to go next, and we might even think about stops that we might make along the way, like, oh, I need to pick up groceries before I go home. And so we use memories to potentially decide between different routes, and maybe sometimes we would deliberately take a more circuitous route if we have some kind of sub-goal we want to achieve. And so we develop these types of tasks, and here's an example of what they can look like. They can be quite immersive, these virtual navigation tasks that we give to people. And we combine these with fMRI. And this allows us to test predictions about how activity in different brain areas relates to different aspects of maybe a complex, multi-step behavior that we might actually engage in often in our daily lives and take for granted. So I've talked about some of this stuff a bit before at Georgia Tech. I'm going to try and go through the background for the research that we do fairly quickly with the goal of telling you about some of the cool things I've done in the past, but also highlighting some of the neat research we're doing now in the lab. So I'll give some brief background and then hopefully jump right in and get through some interesting work where we've tried to identify neural circuitry that enables us to learn and remember different experiences that maybe take place in the same location in an environment, and understand the circuitry that allows us to remember those experiences without some sort of catastrophic interference between those different memories. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means if that's unfamiliar terminology. We'll also highlight some data from our lab and my postdoc, where we're looking at the mechanisms that allow us to use long-term memory in order to guide planning and sort of goal-directed behavior. Basically, how do we think about the future? What does that even mean? How do we generate a simulation in our minds? And then I'm going to end the talk with some newer stuff, so if you've seen me talk before, this will be more interesting for some of you. I'll show some data highlighting the impacts of stress on the neural mechanisms of memory. and really what the ramifications are of those impacts for the types of behaviors that we engage in. And then hopefully I'll have a good bit of time both at the end but also along the way to highlight some of the current and future research directions that we have going on in the lab. Okay? All right, so as a brief background, especially those of you who already study memory, you're intimately aware of this, but the neural circuitry that supports long-term memory is incredibly complex. And honestly, Dr. Mann's talk was a perfect segue into this. He spent a lot of time talking about the subcircuitry of the hippocampus and its mnemonic functions. This is also a major focus for us, and a lot of the data I'll talk about today are in the human hippocampus. Maybe what I'll just say here is I want to highlight that the functions of the hippocampus are intimately related to and in part derived from their interactions with a broader cortical circuitry, and that includes the medial temporal lobe and parietal cortex and the prefrontal cortex. And I'll highlight some really cool data today showing interactions between the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex in the context of translating memory into goal-directed action and planning. Okay. So, one anchoring point for studying the relationship between long-term memory and goal-directed behavior is really the brain's ability to sequence information. So when we retrieve some sort of sequential memory, either it's an episodic memory, as I'm sure you often engage in. We're having conversations with friends and family. Maybe my recounting of the cat last night is a perfect example, but also retrieving sequential memory can apply to retrieving a navigational route. When we retrieve these sorts of memories, the populations of neurons that carry information about or represent the features of those memories can fire in sequential order. And that sequential firing actually allows us to either remember or even generate predictions about what will happen next for a given action that we take. And this is a major focus for the types of navigation tasks that we design. So an example here that's salient to me is when I need to learn the route from my office over in Kuhn to navigate down here to EBB and give this talk. My memory system forms sequential associations between the landmarks, the objects, the scenes, the types of information that fall along that route. And I can later retrieve that information either to communicate what that route entails to someone else if I'm giving them directions, or I can retrieve that information sort of online in order to get here for this talk. And we've known for a long time now that the hippocampus is really important for retrieving this type of sequential information. So an example from the late great Howard Eichenbaum's work here, he's demonstrated, his lab demonstrated that lesions to the hippocampus can really have profound impacts on the ability of a rodent to retrieve a sequence of odors, particularly when there's interference from another representation. And there's that term again, and I'll talk more about that in just a second. In parallel work in humans, we tried to mimic these types of studies and link those mechanisms to human memory function. And so using fMRI, we've shown that similar non-spatial tasks, the hippocampus is important for retrieving sequences of stimuli. And it's actually more important for retrieving those sequences than retrieving associated stimuli that don't have any sort of temporal structure to them. And that's actually a really interesting finding to my mind. So what do I mean about interference, though? Why is this important to this story? Well, in real life, many of our memories actually share a lot of features with each other. Right? So if you're trying to remember Joe Mann's talk from last week, it took place in the same room here, you were eating lunch, you might have even been sitting in the same chair. How do you discriminate that experience from this experience? Well, this happens a lot in the context of spatial navigation as well. So many of the routes that we follow actually cross paths with other routes. So I've got my learned route here to EBB from my office, but I also, probably more often than I should, take a little hike out from my office and go down to the student center and get myself some Blue Donkey coffee. And what I've done here is highlighted the overlap between those routes in yellow. And this is really a major problem for our memory system. Because when I get to this sort of location, the visual cues in front of me are actually associated with two really strong sets of associations. And I can't just sort of blindly follow along whatever feels familiar to me, because actually there are two different things that feel very familiar to me. So my ability to navigate here today and not wander off to Blue Donkey like a daft fellow presumably depends on the hippocampus. Some of our prior work suggests that's the case. And this is putatively because the hippocampus helps us to form discriminable memory traces even when those memory traces have shared information between them. Okay, so we can actually retrieve different sequences through a same set of information, say these common spatial locations. Okay, so why is the hippocampus theorized to be important for this? Well, one idea is that some of the subcircuitry in the hippocampus is believed to support a process known as pattern separation. And what this means is that neural inputs to the hippocampus that might overlap a lot. So say we have some cortical perceptual input to the hippocampus. Well, between those two different routes, those inputs overlap a lot because there is a lot of shared perceptual information. But some of the subcircuitry in the hippocampus appears to be specialized in a way where it can actually recode this input into a more orthogonal or distinct set of representations. And so this has been a focus of some of my earlier work. It's not an easy thing to study in humans, although, as I'll tell you in a moment, we have some new tricks up our sleeve where we're going to try and get after this more specifically. One of the ways that we've tried to test whether that theory is correct in humans is by developing these virtual navigation tasks where we present interference between spatial memories. And we test the degree to which hippocampal function predicts your ability to learn different associations for the same location in an environment. So what we did here was we created a bunch of virtual navigational routes. This is an example of one, and they have these rich but funny cues in them. This is a television, and that's actually me on the beach. I'm famous. So anyway, we create a bunch of virtual routes here, and participants learn to navigate these routes from a first-person perspective using a button box. And they navigate these routes over and over and over again. And they're made up of hallways and intersections between hallways. And at each intersection, they gradually learn to make the correct turn for the route based on feedback. And we do all of this outside the scanner, and we do this to create really strong memory traces, say the memory trace for the route from my office to here. And then the next day, we bring them in to the MR environment, and we give them an fMRI task. And in that task, we have them continue to navigate these highly familiar routes, but we also ask them to learn some new routes. And what's critical is that some of these new routes actually traverse locations that are familiar from those previously learned paths. So here's my Blue Donkey, or well, okay, there's my EBB route, and now they're learning the Blue Donkey route. And this forces them to confront that sort of naturalistic scenario that I set up for you. And so by comparing the relationship with learning in the hippocampus for this overlapping context with non-overlapping scenarios where there is no ambiguity, there is no interference between memories, we can try and identify whether it is in fact the case that hippocampal activity seems to support, seems to play a special role in learning these different associations for the same location. Any questions about that task? Okay. So what's interesting is if you look at participants' performance in this task, people are smart, and they're actually pretty good at learning to navigate these overlapping locations and these non-overlapping locations. So this is an example of the group learning curve for one of these overlapping decision points here. And what you'll see is that people learn to navigate an overlapping decision point with similar efficiency to learning to navigate a new, distinct, non-overlapping route. But even though we're sort of behaviorally equally good at doing this, if we do a targeted analysis of hippocampal activity, what we find is that actually, not only does hippocampal activity predict the learning rate within each individual for these overlapping routes, but it actually has a significantly stronger relationship with overlapping route learning rates than non-overlapping route learning rates. And that suggests to us that something about the hippocampal computations is more closely coupled to our ability to learn this type of route in green than this type of route in orange, even though we're able to do both problems with similar efficiency. And it's worth noting these findings actually converge with a non-spatial version of this task. It was sort of a human analog to the rodent odor task that I showed you from the Eichenbaum group. They found the same results. So there's kind of a nice convergence there across modalities. So this isn't just a story about space. This was a really exciting finding for me at the time, and it was an important component of my, actually my graduate work. Time flies. But there are actually two explanations, probably more, but there are two primary explanations that you might come up with for this. One is a pattern separation story. And that is that given a mismatch between our existing knowledge of what to do at one of those intersections and our current new goal, pattern separation could help us form a new discriminable memory trace for that same location such that it directly supports our ability to retrieve one or the other memory on the fly as needed. But that coupling between hippocampal activity and overlapping route learning could also be attributed to maybe some sort of integration story. So maybe we learn non-overlapping routes a certain way. They're pretty easy. Maybe we kind of jump right into trying to habitualize those sorts of routes. But when we're learning two routes through the same environment, maybe the fact that we recognize it's the same environment encourages us to bind those routes together and build a cognitive map of that space. And so maybe that's why hippocampal activity actually predicts the learning rate for overlapping more than non-overlapping routes. And with that older work, we couldn't really directly address that, but it's something we're going after now in our lab. So we've developed a new version of this paradigm where we can take advantage of some more recent analytic techniques to try and analyze the representational content that's coded within patterns of fMRI activity. And I'll talk about that a little more later in the talk, but the general idea is we can try and decode what sort of mnemonic information is active at a given moment from the pattern of fMRI activity. And what's really cool for this type of research question is we can track whether the similarity between representations for different memories changes over the course of learning. So we could test now whether these representations grow together in a sort of integration story as we learn the environments better and better, or whether they start to pull apart and become more distinct memories. We can also look for where that happens in the brain. It doesn't have to be a purely hippocampal story. So I'm very excited about that work that we have ongoing, and I also want to highlight that not all of the choices in these environments are created equal. If you read papers on spatial navigation, a lot of route navigation tasks are discussed as if a route is a unitary construct. But truthfully, something very different could happen when two routes converge with one another and when they diverge from one another. And that's because when two routes converge, the participant actually winds up heading in the same direction. And if the participant has a good spatial map of the environment, they might become aware of that. when two routes diverge, they're actually headed in a different direction. So if you're learning these routes in a more spatially oriented way, this might be an easy decision for you because you're headed in the same direction regardless of what route you're following. This is a difficult decision because you're actually choosing between two options. But if you're learning the routes in a more response-based way, like you want to learn, I turn left at this landmark. Well, this is a situation where you make a different response at the same location, and this is a situation where you make a different response at the same location. So these could be slightly different things, depending on who you are as an individual. And it turns out that is the case. People differ in the degree to which they can navigate these two locations with the same efficiency. And that's very interesting to us. Actually, the reaction time curves are even more revealing than the accuracy curve that I have here. But so we have some ongoing research where we're trying to pin down why are people different at this, and what's different about someone's mnemonic structure if they are treating these as very different choice points in the environment versus treating them as quite similar. Okay. So that's some of our old work, and I think it's a nice segue into some of the things we're doing now in the lab. But it's also important to note that that research is really dealing with ongoing behavior. So how do we learn to make different responses to the same position in an environment and avoid getting confused and making the wrong choice? That sort of thing. But we don't just use our memory to react to our environment. And it's not just a retrospective phenomenon. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we also use our memories to plan and to think about future choices that we want to make. So this is a particularly important function that might also be attributed to the hippocampus. And it's important to think about this because when you consider diseases like Alzheimer's that are affecting the long-term memory system, they might not just impact our ability to discriminate different memories from one another, but they could have a really profound impact on our ability to efficiently plan for the future and decide on optimal choices that aren't immediately in front of us. It's a really catastrophic consideration. So this is a type of big picture problem that we're worried about, and it's another direction that we're taking our research. So we're trying to understand what sort of mechanisms enable us to mentally simulate future experiences and how these mechanisms might relate to our ability to retrieve different goal-relevant representations on the fly. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of background on how the hippocampus could support prospective thinking. And then I'll tell you about two studies that are really closely related that address this question. So think about what it means to plan a navigational route. I tell you, go to EBB this morning. There's going to be a really, hopefully, interesting talk. You need to think about the long-term goal, where it is in the environment. But you also need to think about the route you're going to take to get there. What sort of critical turns are you going to face along the way? What sort of landmarks should you be looking for? And so a major focus of recent research in this area has actually been inspired by, again, really exciting work that's been done in rodents. It's been found that hippocampal neurons that code for locations, place cells, and they are here illustrated by these different colored dots. Not only can they fire depending on what sort of goal the rodent has, but they can actually fire sequentially ahead of the animal from its current position towards its long-term goals. So we see the sort of prospective replay from the memory system in the hippocampus that's governed by current goals in the environment. And so when the rodent, in this task, when the rodent's goals change, so too does the scope of the forward sweep of hippocampal activity. Now, in parallel work in humans, prior work that's tried to look at prospective thought has highlighted that this same network that I laid out for you in the beginning, hippocampus connected to MTL and parietal cortex and prefrontal cortex, that same network is characteristically active in prospective planning tasks. And the overall picture here that we're working from is the idea that this sort of prospective replay in the hippocampus could drive reinstatement out in the cortex of the representations for the objects and scenes and things that are relevant along the route that we think we want to take. Okay, so we can actually visualize through this type of reinstatement what we think we're going to encounter along the route that we want to take. And so this is a potential mechanism whereby the hippocampus could help us to simulate future experiences. And we wanted to test whether this was plausible, whether this seemed to be the case in humans. And this is not an easy problem to solve either. fMRI in general has a lot of limitations. So you have to think outside the box a bit when you're trying to test some of these mechanistic questions in humans. Our general approach was to use a region of interest analysis where we extract patterns of activity from different key areas of the brain, areas in this network. And we get these patterns of activity using whole brain high resolution fMRI. And this is actually a really recent development in imaging technology. It's something we can now do at CABI, and that's very exciting. And so now we can test fine-grained representational information across the brain at the same time. So using this, we developed a virtual navigation task to mirror that used in the rodent study. And I'll briefly orient you to what this task looked like and what the demands were for participants. So this is an overhead view here. What we had were 5 hidden goal locations, and they're demarcated by these blue ellipses. And outside the scanner, participants learned to navigate back and forth between these goal locations until they were really sick of them. And then we put them in the scanner, and we did an fMRI task. And what they saw when they were performing this task was a really sparse environment. They really only had these distal cues available to them, so these mountains and clouds. And that really forced participants to rely on precise spatial memory in order to localize the correct goal location on a given trial. Those goal locations were actually associated during planning with a pair of fractal stimuli, and there's an example of this here. Those served as sort of landmarks that we could give to a participant later during the fMRI task, and we could use those to cue a goal location for them. So we could say, hey, please go to where you remember seeing these fractals. They would then be hidden from view in the actual navigation task, but the participant would use their spatial memory to get to this position. And so participants learned to find these locations really well, and in the fMRI task, we would give them one of these cues, and they'd have to navigate from their current position to their current goal location. It's a little different from the rodent task in the sense that they're not generating their own goal or giving them a goal. The way this worked was pretty straightforward. Basically, each trial participant would start facing the ground, and while they're looking at the ground, we'd show them one of those 2 fractals for a location. We'd say, please think about going to this destination. We'd then take the fractal away, and we'd hold them staring at the ground for what we called the planning period. And the reason it's a planning period in this task is their task is actually to take the shortest path around the circle from their current position to the current goal location. It's a fairly low-level planning task, but actually they're constantly zigzagging back and forth around the circle, and so they do always have to take a moment to reorient to where am I right now, which way am I facing, where's my current goal. So they use this period to think about how to get there. Then they make their selection for what route they want to take, and they actually navigate the environment without those fractals visible to where they think the current goal location is. Okay, so I mentioned these sort of newer fMRI analysis tricks to you already. We're going to apply them here. We can use machine learning type pattern analyses to attempt to decode neural signals that are nested within patterns of activity in, say, the hippocampus, and see if there is a code nested in those patterns that's different for different goal locations in the environment. And the really interesting thing for our research goal is not only is there a code for different goal locations in the environment in the hippocampus, but is that code reinstated prospectively during the planning period, so before they've actually got to that goal and they're thinking about how to get there instead. And what we find is that, in fact, there is. What's shown here is a three-dimensional transformation of the pattern classifier's confusability matrix, which is a mouthful, but what this yellow bar here shows is that actually during planning, when a participant is, say, here in the environment, there's significant detectable evidence for the future goal location that the participant is planning to go on to navigate to. And so this complements nicely some of the work that we see in the rodents. One of the things that we also observed is that this was not specific to the hippocampus, but it also encompassed some subset of the memory system outside the hippocampus. And so we see these prospective representations arising in the hippocampus, but they're also actually correlated on a trial-by-trial level with the representation of future locations out in the cortex. We've got perihippocampal, perirhinal, retrosplenial cortex out in the brain. And so this, to us, is consistent with this memory replay type framing of prospective planning. So we have some prospective signals in the hippocampus, and we can't infer causality from this, but perhaps they are driving replay of the complementary representations out in the cortex for this future event. Now, I don't know if any of you are looking at this with too critical an eye, but we did show them a fractal cue during the planning period for their current goal. And here we're decoding their current goal. So you might be wondering, well, how do you know you're not just decoding the fractal? And that's a very fair question. In fact, it's true that the fractal is a critical part of the mnemonic representation of the goal location. But we had two actually exciting data points from the study that kind of suggest that this representational information extends beyond just decoding the fractal. So first, at a more basic level, we can look at how the machine learning algorithm is thinking about the task. And one of the things that's really important is that the pattern classifier can generalize across multiple cues for the same location. And so at the very least, the representations that we're decoding are maybe a conjunction of the fractals. We hope they're even more than that. There's something about the place itself. But what was really important for us is that if you look at the pattern information that's instantiated during planning in this task, you can then go to the pattern information when they actually arrive at the goal. And what we find is that the neural code for goal location 5 that we observed during planning is actually extremely similar to the neural code that's actually elicited when you go on to get to goal location 5. And so this really supported our view that this is some sort of prospective replay of that future position. And I mean, we would note, of course, that the fractals are not a part of the perceptual information when they actually get to the goal in the fMRI task. Now, if this is about mental simulation, we should see some additional information here in the brain. So I already mentioned, when you're planning your route to EBB, you're not just bringing the goal to mind, but you're also thinking about the route you're going to take to get there. And so what we should see, if the hippocampus is providing a mechanism for mental simulation, is some sort of prospective representation of locations that are falling along the route to the long-term goal. And we call these sub-goals. And what we indeed observed, you can kind of see this here, although there are actually various ways of looking at this signal. What we found, though, is that actually there was greater neural evidence for the representation of the location that falls along the route that they chose than representation for locations that fall along the alternative route that, well, they could have taken, but they chose not to take. And they were not supposed to take it because it was the longer one. And so this is very exciting because it really suggests that in humans we can, at least with the right paradigm, measure prospective, route-specific replay of a route that a participant wants to take. Okay, so I showed you that nice figure at the beginning of the hippocampus and its anatomical connections out to the cortex. And I mentioned already that memory replay is probably a whole brain phenomenon, at least on some level. One of the things I want to highlight here as a transition into the final study I want to talk about is that on a trial-by-trial level, the degree to which future goal information was brought to mind in the hippocampus was predicted by the degree of activity in the medial and lateral frontal polar cortex. And this is putative planning machinery in the human brain. And this was particularly interesting to us because there's been a lot of theorizing and speculation about this part of the brain. Okay, so if you look at the prior literature on prospective planning and route planning, there's sort of a characteristic network of activity that includes some of the areas I've talked about. We've got retrosplenial cortex, et cetera. We very reliably find activity in the anterior medial prefrontal cortex and in the anterior lateral prefrontal cortex. And in the past, including some of my own work, that route disambiguation type paradigm that I showed you before, we've seen that these anterior prefrontal regions are associated with rerouting yourself in an environment to a future goal, usually in response to some sort of changing task rule or encountering some kind of barrier and saying, boy, now I have to actually think about this. How am I going to get to the goal? Because there's a police barrier here. And so it's exciting to see that these are the areas that pop out and correlate on a trial-wise level with prospective memory information in the hippocampus. And from that prior literature, it's been proposed that those areas maybe are helping to integrate the output from the memory system into some kind of strategic plan. But one of the problems with that circular track design that's probably already in some of your minds is, boy, it is boring. It is the most simplistic paradigm you could give someone. They just drive back and forth around the circle for 3 hours. So that's no fun. In an effort to more directly link these computations in these areas to mental simulation and maybe planning something new that you've never quite done before, I developed a more complex paradigm, and I'm actually going to talk about this in the context of a stress manipulation, because it's very interesting to think about how stress affects our ongoing cognition and our behavioral flexibility. And when I present you this study, it's sort of a two-part story then. It's going to tell you a little bit about how stress affects memory, but in so doing, it's also going to tell you a little bit more about how prospective thought might occur in the brain in relation to these two areas that I've highlighted. Okay, so we've recently shown in a non-spatial study that psychological stress, when you manipulate this in individuals, can actually have a really powerful memory impact on the memory system. So it impairs our ability to engage in recollection. And even when we do engage in recollection under psychological stress, the details that we recollect are less accurate and less extensive. And we've attributed this to glucocorticoid action that has a powerful impact on the hippocampus, but there's slower catecholamine effects from the stressor as well. But if stress impairs hippocampal function, if it disrupts prefrontal computations, then it should have a really powerful impact on navigational planning, because we can't recollect in an efficient way all of the details that we need to in order to plan a new route through the environment. And so I developed a task to really try and tax this. This is an overhead view of one of 12 virtual towns that we built. This is an example of what they look like to participants. Basically what we did was we had participants learn these circuitous routes throughout the town outside the scanner. And they navigate these routes over and over and over again, kind of like the circular track study. They get really, really good at navigating these familiar routes. The environments are set up in a way where structurally there are good shortcuts between a given location and a long-term goal. And so if we give them what we call the prospection task for this study, we plop them down here and we say, hey, go to location B. They actually have two solutions. They can follow a highly familiar route, or they can generate a shortcut that they've never taken before to get there. And that's, I think, an important difference from the circular track study. This is a bigger decision-making problem for them, and it also presents an opportunity to simulate a truly novel experience. Now, to do this study, we had a stress group and we had a control group. The stress manipulation was threat of electric shock. Sounds a lot worse than it is. If any of you want to try it out, I can shock you. It's not a big deal. But it is kind of creepy to think about, and so it does elicit a stress response. We use the same manipulation that we used for that recollection study that I alluded to. During training, the participants were unaware of what group they'd be in. So everybody learned the environment sort of free of any abnormal stress other than, the prospect that they might become a member of the stress group. The next day, we put them in the scanner. Actually, after 2 days of training, we put them in the scanner and we give them that prospection task. We plop them down at a location like this. And first, they're spun around slowly so that they can see where they are in the environment and go, okay, I recognize this location. We then give them a taxi driver assignment. So they're supposed to go pick up George Clooney in this example, but it could be any number of famous folks. They're then held in place for what we call the prospection period, just like in the circular track study. And then they're cut loose and they navigate using whatever strategy they want to get to the long-term goal. And then we say, congratulations, you got to George Clooney. And in the stress group, they're under threat of electric shock while doing this. And so they're kind of upset about the possibility that they'll get shocked. And what we can do is we can compare their behavior on this task. And we can also look at some of the neural signals in these key areas like hippocampus and frontal polar cortex. And the first thing I'll show you is that the stress manipulation works. So this is a chart showing the baseline corrected salivary cortisol measure from our two groups of participants. Oh, sorry, my label is gone. So blue is the control group, and orange is the stress group. And so what we did was on their second day of training, before they knew what group they'd be in, we collected a saliva sample. We get a baseline for this certain time of day for these individuals, and then we bring them back at roughly the same time the next day for the prospection task in the scanner. And so these time points are during the prospection task. And so you can see that we've significantly elevated the cortisol in these individuals under our threat of shock. Now, what was really cool for us to observe is that it has a pretty profound impact on behavior. So there are a variety of behaviors a participant could engage in to solve this task, but we'll focus in on the two most easily interpretable ones here. So they could take the novel shortcut, or they could take the highly familiar route. And what you'll see is that under psychological stress, there's a big shift here where stressed individuals take fewer shortcuts and they take more familiar routes. So already behaviorally, we're seeing that people are behaving less efficiently and less flexibly on this task. And you might attribute some of this to a failure to plan out what sort of route they're going to take. And you might attribute that to impaired spatial memory retrieval. And that is, in fact, what we find. So in the stress group, there was dramatically reduced hippocampal and frontal polar cortex activity during the planning period of this task. And if you look at the magnitude of activity in those regions of interest, it actually predicts across participants and on a trial-by-trial level how efficiently they're going to go on subsequently to navigate the environment. So across participants, people who navigate more efficiently recruit frontal polar cortex more during planning than people who, primarily in the stress group, succumb to the stressor and they go on to behave less efficiently. You can also look at the trial-by-trial level and say, wow, we can actually predict whether you're going to take a really short, efficient route on this trial or a long, circuitous route based on how strongly you're activating those two areas that I've been highlighting for you. We can also turn to this machine learning, pattern decoding type approach, and we can see that not only does the degree to which you take a shortcut, not only is that predicted by replay evidence for these future routes that you go on to take, but activity in these areas predicts the degree to which you see replay for the future route you're going to take. And one of the things you can see here, orange is again the stress group, and blue is the control group, and there is a slight bifurcation there, as might be expected, because the control group is taking more shortcuts, and they are also activating this area more than the stress group. The last thing I want to highlight from this is that I think introspectively, we all know that when we're stressed, we don't usually just curl up on the floor in a ball and cry. I mean, we still engage in planning. We still think. We try to solve the tasks. And so this isn't really a story about people just collapsing on this task, but it's more one of a shift from goal-directed prospective cognition towards maybe something that's more of a safe, familiar action that you know is going to get the job done. And so what we can do is we can take these pattern analysis measures, and we can also look at how people think about the task. So if we look at pattern evidence for the different locations in the environment, so we've got the sub-goal that falls along the novel shortcut, we've got the long-term goal, and then we've got evidence for locations along the familiar route. What you can see is that control participants show a similar pattern to what I showed you from the circular track study. So when they're planning how to get to the goal, we see really strong long-term goal evidence, a little bit of sub-goal evidence, and then weakest is the evidence for the alternative route in the brain. What I want to highlight is just that the stressed individuals, even when they're planning a shortcut, seem to do this in a fundamentally different way. What we see is very little evidence for the long-term goal, and relatively higher evidence for the immediate alternative choices in front of them. And there are a few different ways this analysis could go, but I actually like this finding because it fits one of the hypotheses we had for this study, which is that because stress makes it difficult for us to effectively retrieve information from our cognitive map, our prospective thought might be not only impaired, but restricted in its scope. We might focus more on immediate choices in front of us and think less about the long-term things that are down the road. Whatever, we'll deal with those intersections when we get to them. And this kind of looks like that, although there are some limitations with the measure here that, you know, there's still some alternatives open. But this was a really interesting observation. Okay, so I'll end the talk just by summarizing a little bit. And that is that the overarching theme of the research that we're doing is trying to get a better characterization of the neural mechanisms that help us retrieve memories in an efficient, goal-directed way, and in so doing, enable us to plan and navigate our world efficiently. And so we've seen a few highlights from these different experiments here. Maybe in the interest of time, give you some time to ask questions. What I'll do is just take 1 or 2 minutes to plug some of the other cool work we have going in our lab that builds on this, and then open it up. So, I'm really proud about some of the, we built up a lab really quickly in the first year here, and I'm really proud and excited about some of the new work we have going on. One of the things that's really important for understanding flexible navigation and your ability to traverse an environment like those virtual towns there is trying to understand how barriers and the structure of the space actually influences your memory for the space. And so we have some research ongoing and in development to look at how both perceptual and cognitive barriers affect the way that your brain represents space. And now we have some tools to actually look at both those things. We can get the cognitive measures, but we can actually look at what sort of information people are retrieving. And in pursuing these sort of research questions, we can also, in the process, look at whether we can develop interventions to maybe, say, protect you from the effects of stress, or even improve spatial learning. So just as a cool visual here, we can ask a question like, well, if we give someone the ability to, on the fly, get X-ray vision in the environment, can this reduce the difficulty for them of integrating individual root components into some sort of cohesive cognitive map of the environment? And maybe not everybody's the same at doing this. So a really interesting question for us is, what are the cognitive and neural mechanisms that differentiate people who can take that X-ray vision and run with it and really build a super awesome map of the space in their minds versus someone who they just struggle at learning maps, and you can give them all the tools that you want, but they're just not going to get any better at it with those extra tools. Why are these people different? It's a good question. And so these are some of the things we're pursuing. So super brief thanks to, well, a lot of my past collaborators, but also my surprisingly large and growing lab here at Georgia Tech. And I'll just stop and take any questions. Yes?
I wonder how your participants move about in the environment and whether efficiency would make a difference in your findings. For instance, if they press a button to move forward smoothly versus pressing a button to make a virtual step.
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question. I didn't explain much about the interface. So typically we have participants using a button box where they've got a forward, a left, and a right arrow. It's usually a continuous measure, so they can kind of drive, they can start and stop as desired just by holding down drive and holding down left, and they'll go in an arc, for example. But different people are better at, some people are better at this than others. And so that's one reason why we've avoided things like joysticks, because that's an extra level of sort of prior experience. In terms of its impact on some of these findings, in a lot of the cases we're looking at, we're treating participant variability as a random factor. But I think when you look at those individual differences, like in the stress study, it can be a big factor to think about. One of the things I guess I kind of glossed over it, but so for like the stress experiment, they train for 2 days on the task before we go and get those sort of critical measures. So I think that's going to flatten out a lot of individual differences with the actual interface itself. But it's definitely an important concern, and it might still have an impact on their learning. Yeah. Yes?
Great stuff. I have a question with regards to how do you delineate between like understanding a broader strategic context and like rote memorization of the process. So when you understand a broader strategic context, you're going to prioritize way differently on your stress as opposed to just memorize rote things. You're going to collapse. Like you look at people in the military or experts in other fields.
Right. So I think the question is, when you look at, for example, that last slide with differences between the way people appear to be thinking about the task, how do you differentiate this being sort of an altered memory signal from a different type of strategy, a different way of thinking about the problem? And you know, that's a good question. I don't have an answer for you from this particular paradigm. One of the things we can do is we can look at other behavioral measures to try and get a sense for how they're thinking about the task and then map that back onto the neural data. So I didn't mention this, but you can look at the number of pauses people make, how often they stop and go when they're going through the environment. And what you see is that even though these people are taking novel shortcuts more often, they're actually also doing this more confidently, more efficiently. They very rarely stop, and they seem to take sort of straight as an arrow. People in the stress group, even when they take the familiar route, they actually pause more frequently, and they take longer to get there. And so it's almost like they didn't pre-plan what they were going to do. They're taking it as they go, and it seems like a very different, more reactive strategy to approaching the environment.
I think in the interest of getting people off to class, I know there are a few more questions, but maybe we could take those offline with Decker later. Thank you, speakers.
Sure.